Dr. Jamal was sitting quietly in the park, reading a book after volunteering at a free clinic, when a cop pulled up and demanded to know what he was really doing there. No crime, no complaint, just his skin color and a badge looking for trouble. But fate? It has a wild sense of humor. It was a scorching Saturday afternoon, and Jamal Reed was just trying to cool off. He'd spent the morning volunteering at a free clinic and had stopped by a local park to rest and enjoy some peace. Tall, athletic, with a calm presence, Jamal looked like someone who belonged on a basketball court. So, when he sat alone on a bench reading a book, it didn't go unnoticed, especially by Officer Harris. Harris was a seasoned cop. He'd seen a lot, but what he thought he saw that day wasn't a doctor on break. It was a suspicious young man loitering in a rich neighborhood. He parked, walked up, hand already resting on his holster. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, voice sharp. Jamal looked up from his book and gave a small smile. "Just reading, enjoying the weather." "You live around here?" Harris pressed. Jamal shook his head. "Nope, just passing through. Volunteer work nearby." Harris narrowed his eyes. "Volunteer work? Doing what?" Jamal paused, then said plainly, "I'm a neurologist. I run free health screenings on weekends." Harris scoffed. "Yeah, okay. I've heard all kinds of stories." "Let me see some ID." Jamal stayed calm, reached into his bag and handed over his license and hospital ID. But it didn't matter. Harris didn't believe him. Even with the credentials in hand, he ran a background check. Called it routine. People walked by, watched, whispered. Eventually, Harris handed back the ID and walked off with a cold, "You can go now." Jamal didn't respond. He packed his book and left, quietly but not broken. But the universe, it keeps receipts. 3 weeks later, Harris's teenage son had a seizure at a restaurant. It was terrifying. Convulsions, loss of consciousness, total panic. An ambulance rushed him to the nearest ER. The attending neurologist that night? Dr. Jamal Reed. When Harris walked into the room and saw Jamal standing over his son's hospital bed, clipboard in hand, his face drained of color, Jamal gave a brief nod. "We're doing everything we can. Your son's stable. He's going to be okay." Not a trace of resentment in his voice, just steady professionalism. Harris stared at him, shame burning in his gut. I didn't know," he muttered. Jamal looked him in the eye. "You didn't care to know." There was no anger, no triumph, just truth. The man Harris dismissed in a park as suspicious was now the one holding his son's life in his hands. And he did so with grace. Never underestimate the quiet power of dignity. Prejudice speaks from fear. But character, that speaks through action. Jamal didn't need revenge. He earned something better, respect. And in a world quick to judge, stories like his remind us, greatness doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just shows up, in a white coat. It's said that fate doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a whisper, just when you least expect it. But when it speaks, it has a way of demanding your attention. Officer Harris stood frozen in the doorway of the emergency room, his heart pounding as he took in the sight before him. There, beside his son's bed, stood the very man he had dismissed weeks earlier. Dr. Jamal Reed, calm, composed, the very picture of grace under pressure. And as much as Harris tried to deny it, a knot of shame began to twist in his gut. Jamal's steady hand had already assessed the situation. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of experience. "Your son's stable, but we're not out of the woods yet. I'm monitoring him closely, and I'll stay here until we know for sure." Harris could barely speak. The pride that once fueled his judgment had dissolved into something far worse: humiliation. He had mocked Jamal just weeks ago, assuming he was nothing more than a suspect in a neighborhood he didn't belong to. Yet here he was, standing on the other side of a table that separated life from death, with his son's fate lying in the hands of the very man he had wronged. I didn't know," Harris whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. But Jamal didn't respond with anger, didn't seize the moment to rub in his victory. Instead, he simply nodded, as if to say, "It's okay. I've moved on." But Harris couldn't. The shame stung. He thought of all the people who had walked by in that park, all the eyes that had witnessed his blatant disregard for Jamal's humanity. He thought of how, in that moment, he had reduced a man to nothing more than a threat based on the color of his skin. And now, in the most desperate of moments, the very man he had dismissed had become his son's lifeline. As Harris stared at Jamal, the weight of his prejudice grew heavier. This was no longer just a matter of professional duty or societal roles. This was a matter of identity, of humanity. And suddenly, Harris was forced to confront the ugliness of the biases he had carried for so long. Jamal, without ever raising his voice, had shown him the truth in a way Harris couldn't ignore. The doctor's steady presence in the room wasn't a victory. It wasn't about getting the last word. It was about doing what needed to be done for the boy, without hesitation. Jamal had seen this before. People too quick to judge, too eager to label, too wrapped up in their own fears to understand. And yet, he had never sought retribution. His focus had always been on the greater good, on healing. But for Harris, this moment was a revelation. It was the reckoning he never saw coming, the harsh but necessary awakening that would change him forever. I don't know how to thank you," Harris said, his voice strained. Jamal's eyes softened, but his words were firm. "You don't have to. Just learn from it." But Harris wasn't ready. Not yet. The walls he had built were crumbling, but they still had a long way to fall. He had a lifetime of mistakes to atone for, and the road to redemption would not be easy. For now he simply nodded, still unable to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. But one thing was clear. In this moment of crisis, it was Jamal's unwavering professionalism that had made all the difference. Harris had underestimated the man before him. But now, as the weight of his son's recovery settled in, Harris realized he was the one who had been lost all along. As Jamal stood watch over his son, Harris was forced to reckon with something far more profound than his pride. It was his own humanity that had been questioned. And Jamal, in the quietest of ways, had answered. But fate wasn't done with Harris just yet. It was only a matter of time before he would have to confront what he had become, and what he could still choose to be. The days that followed were a quiet reflection for Officer Harris. His son, though still recovering, had made a steady recovery under the care of Dr. Jamal Reed. And while the medical team continued to monitor his progress, something far more profound had begun to shift within Harris. He couldn't shake the image of Jamal standing over his son's bed, so calm, so sure, as if he had always been the one capable of saving him. But that wasn't the hardest thing to face. It was the truth of how he had once seen Jamal. A man who to Harris had been just another face in a sea of assumptions, reduced to something suspicious, something dangerous. Jamal had been everything but that, and Harris had been everything but fair. The days dragged on, and Harris could feel the weight of his own actions pressing on him more each time he passed the park bench where their fateful encounter had occurred. The park was quiet now, the heat of the day replaced with the cool of evening. But every time Harris looked at the bench, it was as if he was forced to relive that moment, his moment of weakness, of arrogance, of fear. But Jamal, he had moved on. He was busy, still working tirelessly, still providing care to anyone in need. His grace hadn't been for show. It was his way of life. And Harris knew, deep down, that Jamal's willingness to help had never been about forgiveness. It had been about doing what was right. 3 weeks had passed since the encounter at the hospital, and now it was Harris who found himself in need of redemption. But it wasn't enough to apologize. Apologies, as he had learned, could be hollow if not backed by real change. He needed to prove he was more than the man who had judged. He approached Jamal's clinic one morning, the chill of dawn in the air, and found the courage to knock. Jamal greeted him as if nothing had happened. No coldness, no reservation. Just a simple professional greeting. "I need to make things right," Harris said, his voice unsteady. Jamal looked at him for a long moment, as if reading the weight of the words that Harris had yet to say. "What do you mean?" Jamal asked. "I've been wrong, and I want to help. I don't know how, but I have to start somewhere." Jamal's expression softened, but he didn't offer immediate forgiveness. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging Harris's willingness to at least begin the journey toward redemption. "Helping doesn't require you to undo the past," Jamal replied. "It starts with what you do next." Harris left that day with more than just an apology. He left with the understanding that doing what's right isn't about erasing past mistakes. It's about making conscious choices, day by day, to live in a way that honors those mistakes and the lessons they offer. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But over time, Harris became an advocate for change. His own understanding of prejudice, power, and humanity was transformed. Not through his words, but through his actions. The healing began in his heart, and it carried through to his work, his relationships, and his approach to the world around him. As for Jamal, he continued his work without fanfare. He never sought to make Harris's growth his victory. He simply kept doing what he did best, saving lives, guiding with grace, and showing the world what true strength looks like in the face of adversity. The journey was never about revenge, or even about proving a point. It was about truth, the kind that heals, the kind that humbles, and the kind that ultimately brings people together. So when we find ourselves faced with the temptation to judge or to look away, let's remember, true justice doesn't come through prejudice. It comes through understanding, through action, and through the quiet strength of doing what's right, even when we've been wronged. If you've learned something from this story, or if it's made you think a little differently about the world around you, share it. Let's start conversations that challenge us all to grow. And don't forget to subscribe to stay inspired, because we all have the power to change the world, one action at a time.